What happened there? You don't want to see what happened there. And we ended talking about American presidents, kind of talking about Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. And if you remember, we talked a lot about Thomas Jefferson, the kind of enigma that he was, being a slaveholder, author of the Declaration of Independence. One thing that we didn't really talk too much about Jefferson, which I talked about in the previous class, was about him being a spokesperson for what he said was the American farmer. So his idea of the United States was going to be this agrarian utopia in which everybody was going to have their own land, everybody was going to kind of be their own king. There's a little gender thing in there. Every farmer was going to be sort of self-sufficient and independent, and this was his vision of what the United States was going to become. And then, of course, you have somebody like Alexander Hamilton. We all know Alexander Hamilton, who believed that the United States was going to be this industrial powerhouse on the back of the Industrial Revolution, which was started in England in basically the 1770s and 80s and moved over to the United States by the 18 teens, 1820s. And Hamilton was like, no, this is going to be a nation of industry. This is going to be a nation of invention, a nation of finance and power. It's not really going to be a farming nation. And remember, Alexander Hamilton is associated closely with New York City, and Thomas Jefferson is associated pretty closely with the slave South, with Virginia. So you have these two kind of poles in American thought between the Hamiltonian vision and the Jeffersonian vision. One thing about both of these poles is that neither of Hamilton or Jefferson really believed in democracy. And when I say that, I mean they believed in the idea that people should be able to vote and choose their own leader in an abstract sense, but neither of them were really big fans of people who didn't own land or have power voting. They did not think of non-landholders voting. Both of them kind of had in their vision you had to own land to be invested in um, making those decisions. And so in a way it was elitist. Both the Hamiltonian and both the Jeffersonian vision, even though one's urban and one's rural, they both have that idea. When we get to the Jacksonian era, which really starts in about the 1820s, many of those laws about voting are starting to fall away. You're starting to find increasingly it doesn't matter whether you land, it just matters whether you pay taxes, and then you can vote, and then you are sort of an informed citizen. So that's a difference. And Jackson is going to be that president who's going to sort of put those two poles of Hamiltonianism and Jeffersonianism together. Jackson is going to be a frontier guy, whereas both Hamilton and Jefferson are on the East Coast. Jackson is going to come from Tennessee. He's going to be really a backwoods kind of leader who comes from the West. So you can think of them, the three of them, as these different ideas of where America is going. And Jackson is going to consider himself a president of the people, of all the people, a democratic president. And he's going to be really the beginning of what we call the Democratic Party, the idea that everybody should be able to vote. And that's still an ideal that the Democratic Party has today and is tied back to Jackson, even though Jackson's ideals are not the ideals that the Democratic Party today would really ascribe to, I would think, in large measure. And we'll see why that's the case as we go forward. So you have this, and Jackson also believed in industry and believed in farming and he believed in all of those kind of together, but also believed that this was going to be this dynamic nation, and he was the president of the people, meaning screw Congress, forget judges, it's the president who has the power. And that's why in the Oval Office, I believe it's the Oval Office, right behind when you see sometimes Donald, not the Oval Office, is another, anyway, he gives a speech often in a certain room. And right behind him is a picture of Andrew Jackson. Because Donald Trump associates himself to a certain extent very closely with Andrew Jackson. This is something which has caused a lot of consternation in historical circles because Andrew Jackson, while many people call him the Democratic president, president of the people, all this sort of stuff, he was also a terrible racist, a slave owner. He was absolutely horrific to the plight of Native Americans. Um, and in many ways, he kind of eroded many of those ideals of popular will through Congress. And you can see a sort of trail as presidents get stronger and stronger, from Jackson all the way to Trump. That presidents have become stronger and stronger, and many people fear that power. And many people look back at Jackson as really not a good influence in that respect. So anyway, we'll get to that. So let's talk about the Jacksonian era. One thing I want to start with before we talk about Jackson, we have to talk. Remember slavery. You can't talk about anything in the United States before Civil War without talking about slavery. One thing I want you to know, and this is not really an aside because it describes the process of what is going on um, during the Jacksonian era, is that slavery is increasingly eroding any sort of consensus that Americans had after the Revolution. So, and each time that slavery comes up as a problem, the American power structure kind of pushes aside these questions of what to do about slavery. We saw this in the compromise in the Constitution, the Three Compromise, in which Southern states say, look, if we're going to agree to the Constitution, if we're going to agree to this idea of the presidency and voting power, et cetera, we need to have representation that's based on how many people are in our state. And slaves are people. They can't vote. We need to count them as people. So in the Three-Fifths Compromise, say you take the population of Virginia, say, and I'm just throwing out numbers which are not true here, but let's say there's 100,000 um, white potential voters in Virginia, or people in Virginia as population, and say there's 50,000 African American slaves, 50,000 black slaves. There's 150,000. Those 50,000 slaves are counted as 3/5 for representative purposes, so they're counted as an extra 30,000 people in addition to the 100,000 full people, right? So it's only really for purposes of representation, but this was a way of increasing the power of the South in relation to the North because there are many more people that lived in the North. So the South was able to get more representation on the backs of slaves by counting them as 3/5 in terms of representation. But of course, they're counted as 0/5 when we get to whether they can vote or not. So this compromise is one of the first compromises that's hatched right at the beginning of the Constitution to kind of shove aside the problem of slaves and slavery into another era. We get to 1820, which we'll talk about today. We get to a really important compromise called the Missouri Compromise. This is a compromise which, just in short, and I'll explain this in more depth, basically says there's a line that runs through the middle of the United States. Above that line, it's free, and below that line, it's slave. So every single new state that comes in above that line is going to be a free state, and every state that comes below that line is going to be a slave state. It's a compromise. It doesn't hold true when it's even made, and it's violated repeatedly afterwards. But from 1820 to 1850, that's the general idea that the United States proceeds by. Whereas that when states get made to the West, those states to the North will be free, and those states to the South will be slave. In 1850, you get another compromise. This compromise is called, quite dramatically, the Compromise of 1850. And in this compromise, California becomes a state, but that old line gets destroyed. And as sort of part of that compromise, California becomes a full free state. But other states above that previous line now get to decide, according to a concept called popular sovereign, whether they want to be free or slave, so they can vote on it. This is essentially the beginning of the end of the United States. Because once you have people voting on the principle as to whether somebody should be considered a human or not, this just causes a huge amount of conflict north and south. So we'll talk about the Compromise of 1850. That comes a little bit later. Then there's going to be another compromise called the Crittenden Compromise, which you don't really have to know. And the Crittenden Compromise never comes into effect, but essentially says, hey, let's put back in the Missouri Compromise. We'll put it all the way to the Pacific, and then we'll divide California in two and make one North free and South slave. That never happens, and the United States falls apart anyway. But it gives you a sense of these different compromises and how they're trying to play with them and come up with some solution as to what's free, what's slave, where can slaves go, is a slave that's brought from the south to the north, is that slave free? All of these kind of really important questions as to the nature of slavery and its legality in the United States are kind of being sort of thought about through these concepts. Anyway, is everybody still there? Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, we do. We do.
Great. So let's go back to this screen. So here we have Eli Whitney. There he is. Man. He invents a cotton gin. This is a small one. Notice what the cotton gin does. Turns that little wheel. Cotton comes out here. This is cotton that can be used. It's kind of refined. Here's a larger cotton gin. And so Eli Whitney's cotton gin becomes the way that slavery spreads like wildfire across the South. And I talked about this a little bit in the last class, but this is kind of new to the lecture. The cotton gin in 1793 greatly increases the profitability of the crop. And here's an example of this. You had something called long staple cotton. I believe this is long staple cotton. So before the cotton gin, that's the only cotton that could be used. Little bits of cotton, as you get down here, this couldn't really be used because it was really difficult to manufacture by hand. But once you have this box that you turn, this crank, and once you're able to refine that cotton by hand, you can start to use all the cotton. That farms so much more profitable. It also creates a type of slavery which is really an industrial form of slavery. Instead, you might have had like 6 slaves on a farm before. Now you have 60, 600, 1,000, 2,000 slaves on a cotton plantation, all growing something, by the way, that you cannot eat. Okay, which means that it's a cash crop. It's being farmed to be sent overseas. It's destroying the land. It's just a terrible crop for the earth. It's a terrible crop for slaves who are engaging in growing it in very, very hot regions in which the growing season is much longer. And so cotton slavery is becoming a terrible thing for slaves. In 1860, and this gives you an idea of how, I say important, with a certain qualifier, how important slavery is for the South. And this is, again, not to excuse what happens in the Civil War at all, but to give you a sense of the Southern mindset. Why do Southerners, by 1860, essentially not consider slaves people? And the reason that they don't is because of money, is because the amount of money that they're making and the economy that they're tied to does not allow them the morality. It doesn't allow them the space to consider slaves as people, because their entire economy, their entire kind of way of life, the way of life that they kind of were born into, and this is Jefferson, for example, was born into slavery. Many of them don't know any other world in which they live in. Again, this is not to excuse it, but to give you a sense of the horrible thing that has occurred over the course of the 60 years since the invention of the cotton gin, between, say, 1800 and 1860, is that you have people who are born into a society in which the entire economy, the entire way of life, is based on the dehumanization of slaves. Because their entire way of life, the entire way that they put food on their plate, is based on a crop which necessitates the use of slave labor. There's no way to grow cotton profitably without being on the backs of slaves. And that's kind of mental gymnastics that they go through. They're like, oh, maybe slavery is wrong. Maybe then some moment they wake up one morning and go, oh my gosh, I'm committing a grave sin. Oh, by 9 a.m. they're like, oh well, whatever. And I think we can see this in things that people do for money all over the world. Make an excuse, and then you just live with it day after day after day, and then you internalize it, you forget about it, and then instead of giving humanity to the people who are really suffering under a certain economic regime, you just kind of throw them to the side. Anyway, that's a longer philosophical thing. But let's look at this. Slaves are worth 3 times as much as all the money invested in U.S. banks as of 1860. They're worth 7 times the value of slaves. If you added them up in terms of what their market value was, 7 times all the currency in circulation in the States as of 1860. They're worth 48 times the entire expenditure of the U.S. government as of 1860. And this is all about cotton, because cotton, not only is it the leading U.S. export from 1803 to 1937, but cotton is the South supplies 90% of the world's cotton by the Civil War. So this is the economy of the South, totally built on slaves and built on the worst form of slavery that then existed in North America, for sure. We can still argue that sugar is a worse form. There is really no substantial sugar slave economy in what is the United States at this point. I actually said in the previous lecture, but I'll talk about it again. The slave regime doubles in geographic size as it moves west. Slaves moves west and south. You have this dehumanization and familial separation of slaves as they move west. Remember, as slave owners move west, slaves are sold west or moved west. They're often separated from the families that they were a part of before. And so that dehumanization, slave owners don't allow themselves to feel that slaves are people, because they're increasingly treating them not as people but as commodities that do not have the family bonds them. So because they can't feel that way. They don't want to feel that way because they're making money. So they're saying, look, yeah, I'm splitting up this mother and the child. Yes, I'm splitting up this husband and wife. Yes, I'm splitting up this family that's lived, say, in North Carolina or South Carolina for 5 generations. Well, you know what? You either say, I'm doing it for money, or you say, well, they're not people. And they decide both. I'm doing it for money and, oh, well, they're not people. And so when you get to 1860, this idea that slaves are, in some case, not people, has become pretty prevalent. Whereas if you go to 1800, that's not really the prevalent idea. It's a more complex idea. So this is what money does to people. I'm going to skip some things here. So. And I want to talk about some Jackson era themes as we get into how this era of this new presidency, or this new idea of the presidency, affects, these Jacksonian era themes affect how this is going to affect slavery in many ways too. So I'm switching to Jackson now. Anyway, sorry. Some things that we have to think about when we think about Jackson are the power of the presidency, the power of the people. Increasingly, this is going to become a boom and a bust nation, a nation of, economic largesse, which is going to continue for some years, and then a crash. We all know about that. We're going through it. We're going through that boom and bust right now. And this is continuing. You go to the 1929 stock market crash, that's the bust. The whole ramp up after World War II, the boom, crash, boom, crash, boom. This is something which defines the United States. And you really start to see during the Jacksonian era. And the notion that, hey, so if you're on the bust side, well, that's kind of your fault. And if you're on the boom side, hey, that's kind of your fault. There's always this kind of valorization of somebody's self-worth as to how the economy goes. And so this boom and bust idea is going to become the way that sort of Americans think about the economy in general. You also have state power versus federal power. This is a really important theme in the Jacksonian era. Whereas you have what is the power of the federal government in relation to the power of the individual states. And Jackson's going to have a really, really important and fascinating role in this, which we'll get to. And also, I think a big theme about the Jacksonian era is the power of the machine. In that, and I say here, flesh and metal both mechanized. Flesh is mechanized in terms of industrial slavery, whereas people are starting to be seen as cogs in a machine. And not only slaves, but also sort of factory workers in the North, who are sort of starting to be seen as cogs in a machine. But also just the sort of mechanization of the landscape, the mechanization of cities, how cities grow up and become sort of like these not only places of business, but also places where nature, by almost definition, does not exist, where nature is contained maybe in parks instead of in sort of wide open spaces of wilderness. So we'll see some of these themes continue throughout as we talk. I'm going to skip these guys. Here's John Marshall, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, hugely influential, important guy. Here's Daniel Webster, one of the most important um, American politicians who wasn't a president in the pre-Civil War era, a senator from New Hampshire. Here we have to the upper left is the wild-eyed and interesting hairdo John C. Calhoun, the Southern firebrand, who is also he became vice president, but he never became president. And Calhoun is becomes the embodiment of the Southern secessionist pro-slavery idea. You'll see Calhoun's name still on buildings all over the place, even at colleges all over the place. They're trying to strip his name from it. But Calhoun is somebody who thinks that slavery is a positive good. Slavery is good for slaves. Slavery is good for everybody. It's the ideal form of human existence. And he will actually die before the Civil War, but he'll be very, very influential in defining that kind of point of view. Down here, you have Henry Clay, senator from Kentucky, who will become kind of the U.S. senator from the West who tries to bring together the North and the South, makes all these compromises about slavery, but also tries to create a strong federal government that will improve the West. And this is something which not every one of these politicians is going to agree. Then we have here to the right, look at him, there he is, that's Andrew Jackson, fighting in the War of 1812. He was a rather brutal and very effective general in the War of 1812. In the Battle of New Orleans, he is a general who defeats the British, even though the British effectively win the War of 1812. For the most part, they just kind of go away after a period of time. But Andrew Jackson defeats them in the Battle of New Orleans and becomes this early American hero in terms of a general hero, a hero who's a military hero. And this is important to understand about Jackson because he comes back to George Washington in that way. George Washington was really the general statesman who becomes the first president. And then for the most part, pretty much between Washington and Jackson, you have a bunch of politicians. You have people who are effectively politicians, who are senators, who are et cetera. And Jackson comes in as the war hero leader. And this is an important thing to recognize about Jackson's appeal and why Jackson becomes so popular. I'm skipping this. Sorry. So let's go to 1820. Here is we've come to something called the Missouri Crisis. This is a very important period of. Hold on, everybody's still here. Still here, right? Can you see me? Hear me?
Yeah, we see.
Okay. Sorry. Am I still sharing that? Can you still see this Missouri Crisis thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, just checking. So in around about the 18 teens and 1820s, the question of the balance between the North and the South, and that means the balance in Congress and its balance in power for the country, is starting to become a really big issue. Because when you get to about 1820, the West is being settled. And many of these areas out West are petitioning to become part of the United States. As you have this rush of Southern slave owners down through what we call today the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and as you have farmers who are rushing west into the Midwest and creating these states in the Midwest, they're petitioning to become part of the United States, and therefore they're going to get 2 senators, and they're going to get more representation in Congress. As we get to 1820, the problem becomes that this balance between the North and the South is starting to get pretty shaky. For the North, for Northerners, the rapid expansion of slavery, cotton slavery in the South, is raising a lot of concerns because that land is being rapidly taken over by Southern slave owners. and they are petitioning rather quickly to become part of the United States. And it seems like there's going to be an imbalance in the U.S. Congress, in that the U.S. Congress is going to be dominated by slave interests. Okay, and the slavery expansion is starting to raise a lot of concerns. In around 1820, 1819, 1820, Missouri, and I'll show you a map in a second. I mean, if you have a map that you can look at, it might be a good idea to look at a U.S. map. Missouri petitions for statehood with slavery. Many of the people who move into Missouri are moving in from, say, Arkansas, and moving in from their slave owners who have gotten essentially across the Mississippi first into this trans-Mississippi area in Missouri. And they petition for statehood with slavery. And many of them who are petitioning are slaveholders. And so, most of the white residents of Missouri, or American, quote unquote, residents of Missouri at this point, are slaveholders, and they bring with them their slaves. And so slavery has already been established in Missouri. And Missouri petitions for statehood with slavery. Now, they petition, and the idea is that northern states are really afraid of this. They're like, well, this is going to tip the balance. There's going to be more slave states than free states. And so they block it. The northern states actually block Missouri's petition for statehood. A politician by the name of Talmadge comes in and says, you know what? How about this? Missouri, you can petition for slavery, but we got to have some sort of plan for gradual emancipation. We have to have some sort of plan such that slaves eventually become free. That's kind of shelved because they're like, oh yeah, we'll do something about that. Whatever, nothing's done. In the meantime, Maine also tries to become a state. Now, Maine, becomes kind of a footnote in history, but it's important in the Missouri crisis. Maine was originally part of Massachusetts, and eventually sort of cleaves off from Massachusetts and wants to become a state unto itself. But in 1820, the South blocks Maine because they're like, hey, you're going to block, we don't want any power from the North. There's going to be increasing power from the North. Maine is wholly free. It's not a slave state in any stretch of the imagination. And so Missouri is blocked by the South. So this is obviously they're blocking each other to try to prevent each other from having power. So the South argues at the time, these are some of the arguments they have about Missouri being, and you can see where the Missouri Compromise is going to come together. It's going to involve Missouri and Maine. But the arguments about Missouri becoming a state, the South argues that all states should have equal rights. So all states should have equal rights to become states, and so this becomes part of the Southern ethos, that all states should be treated equally. Each state should have its own rights defined within the state, so that if one state wants to consider slaves not as people and give them zero rights and allow slave owners to murder them, that's their right, because that state has their own laws. Northerners are like, that's ridiculous. We have a Bill of Rights. We have our slaves, people are not. And so the South increasingly argues, no. When it comes to slavery, especially, that the Bill of Rights only applies to white people. The Bill of Rights does not only applies to free whites in a particular state. They define it in terms of our racial idea. And that slaves, who are increasingly being defined as black, which again, this is not the total definition if you go back 100 years, that slaves are not, and that states should be able to have their own laws in regards to the humanity of individuals within their borders. And they also say, hey, with slavery, the most important thing is property. Remember, life, liberty, and property under John Locke. Everybody has the right to property. So slaveholders should be able to have their property. The property can't be taken away from them. If their property runs away to another state, right, or is stolen, then that property needs to be returned. So you're increasingly having this property argument by slaveholders in regards to slaves, that slaves are first and foremost property, and they are very, very secondarily, if at all, people. Well, what happens? Here's the compromise. I love this little map because it's one of these old 50s style maps. I like how it looks, and I like how it splits up the United States. But let's look at this. Here's all your slave states in the South, colored red. Here's all your free states in this checkerboard pattern. here. So here is Missouri. Now notice where Missouri is, and notice this line. See this line? Now here's a Mason-Dixon line between Pennsylvania and Maryland. Let's ignore that for a second. That line we often refer to as the line between free and slave, largely because states below it were largely slave, states above it were largely free. The Mason and Dixon line does not have any legal, it doesn't really have any legal basis. It's just called the Mason-Dixon line. It's just a sort of let's forget that line. This is a much more important line. See this line? Straight line that divides Kentucky and Virginia from Tennessee and North Carolina. This line, the 3630 line, see this? Runs, now, these states are largely tobacco states. These states are largely cotton states. Can you see my cursor when I say these? Do you see that when I do this?
Yes.
You can see, great. Thank you very much. So these states are largely tobacco, and they're moving west too, but these states are also. So anyway, so Missouri is way up here. Notice how far north in relation to this line Missouri is. Slave owners move into Missouri. They want to become a slave state. Northerners are afraid, wait, this is blocking northern farmers from moving west. Because now Missouri is a slave state. And say you're a farmer in Illinois and you want to move here and not have slaves, you can't really do that because you cannot compete against slave owners. And so this is one of the major things that is angering northern farmers. Maine, see, is Maine up here. So this line in the Missouri Compromise, they come together, both sides in Congress, and they say, look, we're going to allow slavery in Missouri. There's too many slaves there already. But the compromise is, and we're going to allow Maine as a free state. See? So here's your compromise. Maine and Missouri both become states. One free, one slave. We're going to draw a line across the fake line, totally fake. There's nothing to this line aside from a surveyor's instrument. This line is going to run all the way into, and here's Spain. See, here's Spanish territory. So forget about that for now. So, but notice that this is going to be the top of Texas, this line right here. So this line is going to run right across the west. Everything below this, Arkansas territory, everything below this is going to be slave. Everything above this, from now on, is going to be free. This is the exception, and here's the line. So it's kind of a weird compromise, right? They're talking about lines which are essentially imaginary lines. You could go here and you could walk right across here and nobody would know that there's no river, there's no mountains, right? So this is just a fake line. But whatever, everything below it's going to be slave, everything above is going to be free. Now, when we get to the Mexican War, this is going to turn into Mexican territory. And then once we get to the Mexican War, this is all going to be sort of taken over by the United States. And then the idea is, what do we do with this territory now? This is going to be a big question. Is everything south of this line, although is Mexico going to be a slave state at some point? Is South America going to become a slave state? So these are sort of the weird kind of questions that are brought up by this bizarro compromise. And this is a really important compromise. Here's another map of it. Notice here again, New Spain, very important when we get to the Mexican War. And just notice this line moving right across Missouri. So Missouri is going to be slave, and all of these states are going to remain slave. And all these states in the north, especially this unorganized territory, are going to be free. They're not, but we'll see what happens. So here's a Missouri Compromise. I'll go through it. I just explained it all. There's Henry Clay. I'm Henry Clay, damn it. He actually said that. He actually did not say that. But I don't even know why I wrote that. That was probably punch drunk, or not drunk, just punchy. Anyway, Henry Clay's plan. This is Henry Clay's plan, the Missouri Compromise. This is why he's so important. He's like the big compromise guy. Nobody really likes him anymore. I actually went to Henry Clay's house in Kentucky. I was marking some papers for like the AP test, like long time ago, and they took us on a tour of Henry Clay's house. It was very fascinating. Was it Lexington, Kentucky? Anyway, so Henry Clay's plan is, from now on, another part of this. I'm sorry, what's that? Anybody have a question?
Yeah, I had a question.
Sure.
Did we take Maine from the British in the 1812?
No, 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 no. Maine was always part of U.S. territory, but it was originally part of Massachusetts. It's a good question about that is that the northern boundary of where Maine ended and Canada began was something that uh, that was not clear. And by the way, if you go up to northern Maine today, the boundary of where northern Maine ends and Canada begins is still quite sketchy because it's just vast forests and moose. There's really nothing up there. Apologies to anybody from Maine, but so the actual boundary of that was ill-defined um, by the War of 1812. So Maine itself, the vast majority of Maine was settled by Americans, and they were Americans, and they but considered American citizens. So, but there's some truth to that. But many of those boundaries became much more defined in the 18 teens and 1820s after the War of 1812 through various treaties that the U.S. and Britain engaged in. So so but so one part of Clay's plan also is that just like you had Maine's going to be free and Missouri's going to be slave, that's going to be how you're going to do it from now on. So if say Arkansas is going to come in, then you're going to have another free state. So you're going to have this like trade-off, and that's going to be his compromise. And everybody's like, "Oh, thank you, Henry Clay, you came up with this stupid compromise." But the criticisms of it are that this is a ridiculous kind of idea. I mean, these states are defined by these bizarro surveying lines. They're not even defined by rivers or mountains for the most part anymore. And it's just a big band-aid. I mean, yeah, you can say this. It's just pushing, it's just kicking the can down the road. This is not going to solve the problem of slavery and the problem of this inequity or this growing inequity between the North and the South. Remember, the North is industrializing, becoming much more wealthy, becoming much more powerful than the South. The South is becoming much more powerful in terms of becoming a police state for slaves. It's becoming very powerful on the back of one crop of cotton, but it's basically stagnating for all other purposes. And its power in Congress is remaining the same, even though they have much less voting people who can vote, much less free people in relation to the North. And the North is increasingly saying, look, this is ridiculous that the South has as much power as the North. And the South is like, yeah, well, look at all the land we have. I mean, they have their own excuses for it. And it doesn't address growing moral outrage, because the Missouri Compromise in the North is going to have one really big effect. Many Northerners are going to kind of turn on to the fact that slavery is a moral failure and a moral evil. Many, many individuals in the North who before might not have thought about the politics of the expansion of the United States that much in relation to slavery see this whole kind of compromise as just like a devil's bargain. Like, you're doing all this on the backs of people. Like, you're deciding about the humanization of people. You're deciding about whether Congress and this country should be controlled by people who believe that slaves aren't people and that slaves aren't, have no human rights. And this moral outrage starts to grow. Now it's small. By 1820, it's still small. Abolitionism as an idea is still quite small. In fact, there's more people that believe in this concept of colonization, and basically this kind of idea that you should take that you should take slaves, actually physically put them on boats and move them back to Africa. This is where the nation of Liberia in Africa is constructed, basically in this kind of idea that slaves, to remove slavery from the United States, instead you actually physically remove it. This idea is just stupid. I mean, there's just no way of affecting this. It's something that people like John Adams and many prominent American politicians sign on to, but there's no practical way of making this happen. You're talking about millions of people and putting them on boats and sending them to Africa, a place that they've been in the United States for them and their ancestors lived in the United States for hundreds of years, and now you're going to take them because they're black and take them because they were slaves or former slaves or status slaves and move them back to a place that they have no connection to, or at least no familiar connection to anymore. So this is the popular idea of what to do. Abolitionism is growing as an idea, but it's considered so radical that most people won't sign on to it. Certainly, most politicians won't sign on to it. Let's look at in the world of you know, American democracy, as it were, which of course is democracy about those who have the right to vote. You have two ideas. One is that older idea that only people who own land should have the right to vote, and that voting should have some strictures. And that's the idea of the republic, that a republic is composed of those people who are citizens. And this is an idea that also to a certain extent comes out of the French Revolution, comes out of the idea of the citizenry. The word citizen is derives from a French word. Um, this idea that to become a part of the republic, that you are in some sense a citizen and you are invested in it, and therefore that is often tied to owning land. Later it's tied to paying taxes. But in terms of that, so a republic is not necessarily a democracy. Just because you live in a democracy, just because you live in a place in which you have a quote unquote democratic form of government doesn't live in a democracy. And so republicanism is kind of elitist because those people who say don't own land or those people who don't own taxes, say the very poor, there's a belief system that, oh, they don't actually have a right to vote. They're too dependent. The other idea that's starting to arise is that no, if you live in a particular state, say that you live in Vermont, or you say you live in Massachusetts, and you are a resident of that state, you should be able to vote. We basically have that ideal today, that all humans should be able to vote in a state once you're of a certain age. Well, remember, we don't have full democracy yet. Children can't vote, right? Many convicts can't vote. So you don't have full democracy in the sense that every single person can vote. There are laws about who can and cannot vote. Those laws are much less than they used to be. The idea of democracy is that everybody should have the right to make a decision as to who their ruler and their representatives are in Congress. And that democratic ideal is growing as we get to 1820, 1830, 1840, and growing away from this sort of Republican ideal, which is increasingly seen as elitist. You have in places like New York is kind of becomes the birthplace of the idea of representative democracy on a mass scale. You have the rise of political parties that come through suffrage. So increasingly, there's more and more people who can vote. Increasingly, political parties have more and more people who are their constituents, and they increasingly are getting more and more powerful. So political parties, say the two basic political parties as of 1820, you don't really have two political parties. Well, let's say Democrats and Republicans. You have these two vague structures that are political parties. They're growing really, really powerful because not only are they political parties and organizations unto themselves that have vast amounts of people in them, just say in New York, those political parties have ties to particular industries and ties to particular ties to the government. So say when a Democratic leader takes over New York, all those members of the political party then get positions of power. They might get positions of power. They may get hired more in other industries. They may get hired more in government. And so you have these machines that arise. Martin freaking Van Buren right here, which is not his middle name. I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking when I made up these slides. Martin Van Buren is really kind of the leader of the Northern Democratic New York political machine. And he is the one that will give out all of these jobs through patronage. So you have this rise of this machine politics. And really, Martin Van Buren becomes the progenitor of that. He will later become president. He will later be Andrew Jackson's vice president and later become president after Andrew Jackson, one of the most unsuccessful presidents of all time. I'm going to skip the American system because we just have to go on. So, because I want to get to the election of 1824. If you want to look over the American system, Henry Clay look at it, it's very important to talk about the expansion of the West and ideals of American nationalism, etc. But I can't get into it right now. Let's get the election of 1824. Everybody loves the election of 1824 because in fact, nobody does, but it's a very confusing election. Remember the Missouri Compromise 1820. Election of 1824 is the first election in which you don't have a Virginia politician as the front runner. Virginia basically a Democratic Republican. Like Jefferson in Virginia, Madison, Virginia, Monroe, Virginia, and then 1824 you have this new election. The Federalist Party of Washington Adams essentially dies in 1824. It essentially disappears. It no longer exists. So you have 5 candidates. They're all Republican candidates. They're also called Democratic Republican. It's confusing, but just let's call them Republican candidates because I'm putting it in quotes. It's just too difficult to discuss the intricacies of the different parties at the time. But basically, they're all the same party. There's no political party because there's no Federalists anymore who are running against the Jeffersonian, Madisonian, Monrovian Virginians. There's just these 5 candidates, and they all consider themselves part of the same quote-unquote party. You have John Quincy right down here, the son of John Adams, the first kind of, son of a president kind of running. You have John C. Calhoun, remember him, South Carolina firebrand, pro-slavery, etc. He's running, former Secretary of War. You have some other dude. You have Henry Clay, some other clues, Crawford down here. We won't talk about him. You have Henry Clay, here, Speaker of the House, very important, right? Remember the Compromise and then the American, which we can talk about. We have Andrew Jackson. Okay, actually, here's Andrew Jackson. Sorry, this is John C. Calhoun. Here's Andrew Jackson. And we have Andrew Jackson, senator from Tennessee. Old Hickory, the war hero from the War of 1812. And you have all these 5 guys running against him. What happens when 5 people are all running? And each of them, everybody still here? I heard a ding.
Yeah.
Everybody still here? You guys hear me?
Yep.
Oh,
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay, sorry. Here we go. Going back to this. So here's the election of 1824. I love these maps. The election of 1824 is the first U.S. election in which nobody wins a majority of the vote. Okay, so what I mean by no person wins a majority of the Electoral College. The Electoral College is split effectively between these four people. Notice this. John Quincy Adams wins 84 electoral votes, mostly from the old Federalist Party in the North. Andrew Jackson, oh, look at this. Andrew Jackson, a lot of support in the South, but a lot of support in the North, too. Look at that. He gets Pennsylvania, right? A lot of support. He's got 99 electoral votes. Pretty good. Henry Clay wins his home state of Kentucky, wins Indiana, or I think Ohio, excuse me, wins some votes up there. So he wins some, wins, Georgia. Pretty important. But anyway, this is a mess. In order to become president, you have to win 50% of the electoral votes. Nobody has won that. Okay? Nobody has won that. Now, Jackson, you might think, won the most, so he should become president. Well, that's not what happens. If no candidate wins a majority of the electoral votes, and this holds even today. So if, say, you have an election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, right? And it comes down to the wire, and say you have a third-party candidate who, say, wins California, okay, which is a good example because they have a lot of electoral votes. Donald Trump and Joe Biden say they win 45% of the electoral votes each, and then this other candidate wins 10% of the electoral votes. Nobody becomes president. The presidency is kicked to the House of Representatives. So in the House of Representatives votes on who should become president. And they vote according to this kind of bizarro way in which they basically state has a vote based on their representation. Anyway, it's confusing. This election gets kicked to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives votes Andrew Jackson, Quincy Adams enters into this bargain with Clay, who, by the way, is the Speaker of the House, enters into this bargain and says, look, you get your guys to vote for me and make me president, and that's what happens. So even though Andrew Jackson wins the majority electoral vote, he does not become president in 1824. This makes Andrew Jackson absolutely livid. he is so angry about this. He says, look, I won the popular vote. Look, I won the mostly electoral votes, and now I don't become president. And who becomes president? John Quincy Adams. So Jack is angry. He goes home, but he's stewing and he's waiting for 1828. In the meantime, excuse me 1 second. Um, 25. In the meantime, a battle is brewing in the South about a tariff. And this is a tariff which is passed in 1828 at the end of John Quincy Adams' first term in the presidency, in which the tariff is meant to protect textile factories in the North. So it's meant to increase the price of finished goods, and so that those people who are making, say, clothing in the North will be protected but from cheap imports that come in from the British Empire. So the South, by the way, is sending a lot of its cotton to Britain, and Britain is sending back clothing to the South, and they're buying this clothing at a cheaper rate than even the North can sell to the South. And so in Congress, they pass a tariff which is supposed to protect those textile makers, protect what they're creating, protect essentially that they're making, the cloth that they're spinning, and make those textile factories more profitable in relation to British and other countries' textile makers, France, etc. Well, what effect does this have on cotton growers in the South? This is kind of an economic thing, but it's important to understand. Cotton growers in the South now, with this 35% tariff, which means all the new clothing that's coming into the country is hit with a 35% tariff. So say it costs, say, $1 before for a shirt coming from Britain. Now that shirt's going to cost $1.35, and the shirt coming from the North now is supposed to be more competitive against that $1.35 shirt. Maybe that shirt was originally $1.40 from the North. Now it becomes much more attractive to buy that shirt from a northern state, right? The South, though, is like, what? You just increased the price of everything. All my clothing, all my finished goods are now coming in with this 35% tariff. I don't want to pay that. I want to get the cheapest product. What that also does in this tariff of abominations is, and here's how it works, 35% tariff. South has less money to buy stuff because they're paying more money out, right? They have less money to buy goods. The price of cotton, goods produced, we're going around this way. So we're going clockwise. 35% tariff. Goods produced by Northern factories are now the same price as European goods. Demand for European goods falls, right? Because European goods are not as attractive anymore. European demand for cotton falls because now they don't need as much cotton because they're not selling as much. The price of cotton falls because that's where the South is selling most of their cotton. And now the South has less money to buy goods and less money to pay for more expensive shirts. So the South is really angry. And you can kind of see, regardless of the fact that the South is, the slave-owning kind of nightmare, you can see why Southern consumers and cotton growers are both pretty mad about this tariff. What happens is that Southern states, under the leadership of John C. Calhoun, to a certain extent, and basically in the South, South Carolina says, you know what, we're not even going to collect this tariff. We're not going to do it because this is ridiculous. We have our right as a state. You have your federal law. We have our right as a state. We're going to nullify law. They try to nullify a federal law, and they say we're not going to collect this tariff, and screw you. The federal government says you can't do that. You can't nullify a federal law. So this is brewing as a big problem. Then the election of 1828 happens. Adams is hugely unpopular in the South. Andrew Jackson is very popular. He runs Adams. Jackson now has the support of the Van Buren machine in New York. He has the support of northern and southern farmers. He has these frontier origins. He's a war hero. He wins in a landslide. Jackson comes back 4 years later and absolutely crushes John Quincy Adams. huge turnout. But the Democratic Party turns out in the North in vast numbers, and they vote for Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson really becomes the first Democratic Party president. Um, and as he thinks of himself as being by the people, the first president to be really voted by the people of the United States, the power goes to his head. He brings in that whole sort of ethos of him as a general. He says, who has the power? I have the power. I was elected by the people. Congress, you guys were elected by some people in the middle of nowhere in New York, you people in the middle of nowhere in Georgia. You guys don't have any power. I have the power. And this idea of the presidency as being kind of invested in the power of the presidential vote increasingly becomes the way that presidents start to see themselves. And this will trace this from Jackson to Lincoln to Teddy Roosevelt to FDR to, so on to Donald Trump and so on, Ronald Reagan and so on and so on and so on. Each of those presidents kind of says, yeah, Congress, the one people voted for. So what is Jackson's effect on presidency? There's a lot of effects. He fundamentally transforms it. One really important thing that he does is he institutes the spoils system, which essentially says, hey, you know what? I'm the president now. All those people who were in the civil service before, and Donald Trump to a certain extent is trying to do this too, I'm the president, basically tries to fire most of the civil service of the federal government. Many of these people had kind of been in positions they thought were going to be there for life. Jackson comes in and goes, no, to the victor go the spoils. I won. I'm the conquering hero. You guys are fired. I'm bringing in my people. And so he institutes the start of that. There would then be reforms to the federal government such that people in the federal government would be allowed to have their jobs for a longer period of time, because there is a certain interest in having people have their jobs for a long period of time in the federal government for continuity, so as not to upset the government and to have sort of that expertise. But Jackson tries to institute this spoil system. But those reforms will come later. His effect on executive power is even more important. During the nullification crisis, remember I talked about the tariff of abominations. And I remember we talked about South Carolina trying to nullify this federal law, this tariff law. In 1832, they say we're not collecting the tariff. And this crisis in 1832 becomes really important. The theory is that states could decide, this is South Carolina's theory, states could decide that national laws are unconstitutional. They can say, you know what, you have this national law, that's fine. I consider it unconstitutional, I'm not going to follow it. In 1833, Congress passes a bill called the Force Bill. And in this Force Bill, they say, Andrew Jackson, the president, has the power to use the U.S. Army to make South Carolina pay this tariff. Meaning that if South Carolina continues, South Carolina State House, if their government continues to not collect this tariff, Andrew Jackson can send U.S. soldiers into South Carolina and force them to pay this tariff. The effects of this are basically South Carolina ends up standing down because Jackson essentially threatens to send in the U.S. Army to South Carolina to make them pay this tariff. The larger importance of the nullification crisis and why this might seem like something you've never heard of, but the larger importance in the nullification crisis is that power that Congress gives Andrew Jackson to allow the federal government to militarily interfere with a state that is saying that the federal government has no power over them is the same power that Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and 1861 will take in regard to this when the South tries to secede. The South will say, we secede from the United States. We nullify, in effect, your federal government laws. We are no longer part of your federal government. We are part of a new government. We decided to be in it before. We can decide to be out of it. And that same power that the U.S. Congress gives Andrew Jackson, that precedent that's set in the nullification crisis, is a precedent that will carry over to the powers that Abraham Lincoln has when he orders the U.S. Army, the Union Army, to go into the South and fight former other Americans who are now Confederacy and engage in a civil war. So this is a hugely important precedent that's set in terms of giving the president a certain amount of power that might not have sort of been elicited or elucidated before. That power might have been latent, but now the Congress gives Jackson that power. Jackson takes that power, threatens South Carolina. South Carolina stands down. So it's a pretty important development. Another effect that he has is on the economy. He basically gets rid of the national bank. He vetoes the renewal of the bank and illegally defunds it. This is very important. This is a cartoon to the right that sort of defines this. I won't get too far into this because he basically ends the federal banking system until 1913. There's no real unified American currency really until 1913. If you look in your wallet, most of those bills you see are post-1913 Federal Reserve notes. The Federal Reserve is really only established, during the Woodrow Wilson administration. And so even during the Civil War, the reason why the North is so powerful in relation to the South is the South doesn't really have a banking system. That's a whole, I can't get into that right now. It's pretty important. But it creates a financial disaster, which creates a financial collapse in 1837 after Jackson leaves office. He sets up essentially the United States for a giant financial collapse. In any case, excuse me. Oh, okay. Yeah, 15 minutes. That's good. Here's a picture of Andrew Jackson sort of beating back the bank. Here's order for the removal of the public money deposited in the United States Bank. He basically takes the money out of the U.S. bank and puts it in these things called pet banks. So basically takes it and puts it in these banks that he favors in different states. Effectively ends the U.S. banking system. Many people to the west, Western farmers love this. They think, oh, this is great. This kind of Eastern banking juggernaut is destroyed, but it also makes the United States weak. Let's look at Jackson in relation to Indian policy. So I think if there's anything that's associated with Andrew Jackson today, you have power of the presidency, the idea of mass democracy. You have the power of the presidency in relation to nullification of state laws by states that want to secede or assert their power over federal law. Then you have his, effect on the banking industry. These are huge. They have huge effects for the United States going forward in the 19th century. His relation to Indian policy will certainly become the darkest mark on his presidency. Will come to define in many ways the kind of person that Jackson is. And there are a lot of people that still today like Jackson as a president and like the fact that he asserted federal power over South Carolina. There are many people that like Jackson and his effect on the federal bank. They like, in theory, they like what Jackson did there. But what Jackson does in relation to Native Americans is indefensible. I mean, it's just indefensible in terms of human rights. Jackson, before, he's involved in the War of 1812, but even during the War of 1812, he's involved in something called the Creek Wars in Florida. And these wars are kind of an adjunct or kind of a corollary of the War of 1812, in which you have Native American tribes, Seminoles, the American groups in Florida who are fighting against the United States or fighting against United States interests in the South. And he leads these, the U.S. Army against them and is terribly brutal against these Native American tribes. There's a story. I've heard this story. I don't know if it's true, but the story is that he is making sort of saddle reins out of the skins of Native Americans. I mean, this is really terrible stories about his treatment of Native Americans during this war and the kind of war crimes and atrocities that him and his family commits against Native Americans in the Deep South. In any case, he then kind of becomes, aside from this kind of brutal kind of Indian fighter in the South, he then becomes the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, and so that becomes the way that he's seen. But he has this earlier history in the Creek Wars. Remember also when I say War of 1812, it begins in 1812 and extends to 1814, so that's why we have the Creek Wars are kind of part of it. Anyway, in Georgia, and this is kind of apart from Jackson, and this is happening in the 1820s. In Georgia, the Georgia legislature, Georgia politicians essentially passed something called the Cherokee Codes. The Cherokee Codes are kind of like the Black Codes, in which they basically define how the law should treat Cherokee. And just as the Black Codes, actually, I haven't talked about the Black Codes yet. Black Codes are a series of laws passed after the U.S. Civil War, which basically say blacks can do this, blacks can't do this, blacks can do this, blacks can't do this. In Georgia, you have a series of Cherokee Codes, which essentially define, hey, if you're a Cherokee, you basically strip Cherokee of their rights. Now, remember, Cherokee at this time in Georgia and in many other southern states, North Carolina, Alabama, many of them consider themselves American citizens. Many of them own slaves. Many of them own land. Many of them consider themselves having sort of an investment in the United States. They had their tribal, relationships, but they also consider themselves citizens. These new Cherokee laws strip them of their rights. Essentially say that white settlers, white Georgians, can essentially annex Cherokee lands. So the state annexes Cherokee lands. Cherokee, like, what are you doing? We own these lands. We actually have deeds to these lands. Annexes Cherokee lands, abolishes Cherokee government. They have their own governments. They have their own courts and laws. Abolishes them. Seizes it. Sells their land at lotteries to white landowners. Prohibits whites from living on Cherokee land. But that's increasingly defined as what has not been seized. So these Cherokee codes are absolute human rights violation of the highest order. And the Cherokee are almost dumbfounded. They're forced onto these kind of reservations. Their lands are seized from them and sold at lotteries and sold to speculators. In 1830, the U.S. Congress passes the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Again, one of the most vicious and horrific laws the U.S. Congress has ever passed. In this law, essentially says anyone who is an Indian or defined as a Native American east of the Mississippi shall have to move to lands that they are granted west of the Mississippi in what is effectively Oklahoma and several western states. They need to move there voluntarily. If they do not move by a certain point, sometime in the 1836, 1837 region, they will be moved by the U.S. Army at gunpoint to those lands. It's called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Cherokee Nation goes to the Supreme Court, 1831. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. Worcester versus Georgia. Two things that go to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court decides in both cases, this is unconstitutional. You can't do this. You can't do this. You can't remove, U.S. Army can't go in and remove these people who are, in some cases, American citizens. You can't remove them. In fact, in one of these, the Supreme Court also decides during this that Native American tribes are sovereign nations. You cannot go in. They have sovereignty. They are separate and apart from the United States. They are dependent on the United States to a certain extent because they're surrounded by the United States, but they have their own tribes and laws, and they should be allowed to have them. They have sovereignty. This is the sort of reservations in which we still have today. It's decided by many of these Supreme Court decisions. Well, in 1836, a splinter group of Cherokee signed something called the Treaty of New Echota with the U.S. government, which essentially says you can have the lands and we will leave. All of those individuals who signed that treaty are later assassinated by representatives of the Cherokee Nation. In 1838, the U.S. Army goes into Cherokee lands and at gunpoint removes thousands upon thousands of Cherokee men, women, and children, forces them to march over 1,000 miles across the Mississippi to these lands. Thousands die in the process. And this is not just happening. This does not just happen in Cherokee lands in Georgia and Alabama, Tennessee, etc. This is happening all over the country. Native Americans are forced off of their lands that they've had for, remember, thousands of years, and forced to march to these lands out west here. These lands in pink, notice they're just lines. All of these lines are usually in land that is almost unarable. You cannot grow anything in most of these places. Oklahoma, all the way into the 20th century, into the early 20th century, will be referred to as Indian territory on U.S. maps. Most lands are given to the Cherokee, Creek, etc. You see how they're split up. Native Americans, most of them never even settle here. They get there, they realize they can't farm it. Speculators then come in and say, "Hey, can you sell me this land?" They sell the land for almost nothing, and they get it's absolutely one of the worst um, travesties in American history. Not only the Cherokee codes and the Indian Removal Act, but this forced removal of Native Americans to these lands that then are eventually stolen from them anyway, even though they're almost worthless to them, is a legacy that has never been fully ameliorated in the United States. Native American tribes today still have reservations and native lands, still have the highest incidence of alcoholism, still highest incidence of violence, still highest incidence of premature death in the United States today. The pandemic today is ravaging some of these reservations out west. So it's a terrible legacy. And Jackson, when he's told, when the Supreme Court passes these, basically makes these decisions to say you can't do this, he says, "What army exactly does the Supreme Court have? Why does the Supreme Court send in the army that will force me not to send my army in and remove them?" That's essentially what happens. And so he also asserts against the Supreme Court, basically says, "I'm the commander in chief of the armed forces. They can say anything they want. They can talk, 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 talk. They can't make me do anything." And so, but 1838, he's no longer the president. Martin Van Buren's the president. So the Trail of Tears actually occurs under Martin Van Buren, but the removal is allowed to take place under, to start to take place under Jackson. And that is Jackson's eventual legacy. What are his Jackson? I believe that I'm running over here. Am I running over? No, I got. Jackson's effects are that he fundamentally transforms the nature of the presidency. Jackson is now King Jackson. I mean, this is how we see his opponents, right? Born to command. He vetoes more laws than anybody else. He sort of really asserts the powers of the presidency that have before been latent and not been used. He believed in limited government. He believed in state power. So that legacy is going to carry forward into, is going to carry forward into the idea of states' rights in relation to secession, which is going to take place just about 24 years after he leaves office, right? So we think about Jackson as part of this other Jacksonian era, but Jackson really, in many ways, sets the stage for the dissolution of the United States. His assertion of presidential power is going to give Abraham Lincoln certain rights, right? I mean, or give him certain ideas or certain precedents to go by. But Jackson, in another sense, is going to really revive the idea of, he gets rid of the U.S. Bank. He gets rid of, so in another way, he's also raising the power of the states in relation to the federal government. So he kind of does both at the same time. The power of the electorate, he also makes clear that, hey, whoever votes president, that becomes kind of almost a mandate. That president has a mandate. This will go forward into Lincoln. Lincoln will be seen to have a mandate that he will become, and this is one of the reasons why the South secedes. They're like, well, look, he's going to end slavery, which is not what Lincoln says. But so these things, Jackson and Lincoln are very closely tied in terms of looking at two presidents, and Jackson sets the stage for Lincoln in some ways, and in another way, Jackson sets the stage for the secession of the South. Both sides kind of look to Jackson's precedent. He has the defense of the Union. The Union, the United States, how Jackson defines it, and this is how he sort of sets the stage for Lincoln. When all the states decided to become part of the United States in 1776, and then with the Constitution in 1787, that decision to be part of the Union was inviolable. That decision was not reversible. That was a one-way street. South Carolina cannot say, I'm going to secede because I don't like your tariff. Jackson says, no. You decided to be part of the Union. The Union wasn't like a union where it was like, you don't like it one day, I'm going to be part of another, I'm going to leave. The idea of the United States as a union is, it's a one-way street. You're part of the United States forever. You can't leave. And that's the precedent Jackson sets. Lincoln's going to go on that too. The South is going to say, well, that they don't consider that. Jackson's going to expand executive power, not only in relation to the Supreme Court, in relation to Congress, in relation to what he can do with the Army, etc. And also the effects of Jackson in being sort of this progenitor of mass democracy in the United States, in which everybody should have the right to vote, even though Jackson is a terrible racist and slave owner. In a sense, this mass democracy idea starts to grow and starts to encompass even abolitionists who, start to say, yeah, everybody should have the right to vote. Former slaves should have the right to vote. Free blacks should have the right to vote. Everybody should have the right to vote. Women should have the right to vote. So in a sense, the mass democracy that brings Jackson to power, although Jackson is certainly no great suffragist or women's suffragist or that is growing through Jackson, and that idea of mass democracy really becomes kind of the ideals that we have today in the United States, that everybody should have the right to vote. Jackson probably would look askance at today's world and say, no, I don't believe in that. But that ideal still, you can trace back to Jackson and his election. You can also say the rise of unions, the rise of worker representation. That is also something which arises during the Jacksonian era, in which workers start to gather themselves in relation to their power in relation not only to state power and the federal government. They are in turn, to a certain extent, also inspired by the Jacksonian ideal. So Jackson is a complicated figure. You can't say one way or the other. We can dismiss him today as a racist and as almost a genocidal maniac when we talk about what happens with the Indian Removal Act. But there are other effects of Jackson which, whether he intends them or not, we can still see, and I think most of us see as positive forces in American life. And so he is a very enigmatic figure, very important president, and very, very important for the rest of this course. You can't understand him. You can't understand what happens between 1820 and 1861. You can't really understand what happens till today without understanding Andrew Jackson. So after he leaves, the U.S. economy falls apart in 1837 because he's kind of an economic idiot because of what he does to the federal bank, but that's a whole other story. I won't talk about that. In 1840, then there's a new election, and William Henry Harrison wins, and William Henry Harrison dies within 2 months of taking office. And the period between 1840 to 1860, which I don't know if I have a map of it. 1840 to 1860, one-term presidents. Every single president serves, either dies in office or serves for one term, and it creates a certain amount of chaos in the American presidency. So between Jackson and Lincoln, you really don't have a strong president. You just have a series of presidents that you have Polk, who engaged in the Mexican War, but for the most part, you have this series of American presidents who are relatively weak. And that creates a weakness also in the United States, which sets the stage for the dissolution of the United States in 1860 and 1861. And we'll talk more about that. Next week. All right.